Hello and welcome to Church in Maine. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. On this episode, we talk about a topic that very few people want to talk about, and that is mental illness. And we talk about it with someone who belongs to a profession that doesn't want to talk about it. That is clergy. And so on this episode, we'll talk about clergy who are dealing with mental illness. Well, thank you, Seth, for taking the time to talk. I know this is actually the third time to try to do this, so it's the wonders of podcasting.
Absolutely.
Well, I think the first thing to start off with is just to tell us a little bit about your background. I know that you are a pastor in Scandia, Minnesota, which is just kind of north of the Twin Cities. But just be curious to hear a little bit about your background. And I know that you come from north of the border as a Lutheran pastor. Mm-hmm. So kind of to hear your background.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And my background, I grew up in Coquitlam, British Columbia, a suburb of Vancouver, British Columbia, and I was a cradle Lutheran. And I lived there in the greater Vancouver area until I was 29 years old. I moved to Vancouver Island, and so I had an undergraduate degree at the time. Decided to become a pastor at that point at the age of about 30. Went to seminary, and I was, did an internship in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is pretty far north. After that, I moved to Kingston, Ontario, Canada for 3 years for my first call. And then I took a call here in Scandia, Minnesota, which is due north of St. Paul, Minnesota, about 35 minutes out of downtown St. Paul. And we're a rural bedroom community, and that's where I do my work as a pastor.
So in kind of all of your growing up, when did you or family members kind of early on start to kind of know what was going on with you when it came with mental health?
So yeah, the way I would categorize my family is a family where the genetic and generational effects of mental health were apparent really from my time of childhood, even from birth, I would say. So there were environmental effects from alcoholism from other family members, and there had been a few members of my family in previous generations that had mood disorders. And when I started to see mental health issues manifest in myself, that was in my early preteen years through to my teenage years. That's when I started to see heightened anxiety, loss of sleep, and a propensity for addiction, which all are early warning signs of a possible mood disorder. And so that's when my parents became concerned. I had other members of my family with more advanced symptoms that were older than me that had been hospitalized. So at that point, it was pretty tense in my family, pretty chaotic and confusing because parents are trying to help their kids and also learn a lot about mental health and specifically mood disorders in general. So I think that's the best way I can describe my teenage years when things began to manifest.
And then moving into college, did things change? Did things get better, worse?
I would say, yeah, things got worse as I moved into college. So my high school graduation was marked with a major psychological incident. So I would call it a major incident of psychosis, my first psychosis. So that's very common for people with mood disorders, where you would have psychosis, which can manifest in many ways. There can be a depressive psychosis where someone just can't get out of bed. There's manic psychosis, and really anything in between on that spectrum. Some people have delusional psychosis that may involve hallucinations as well. But for myself, it was a manic episode marked then ended by a major depressive episode, which pulled me out of school at a time where I was graduating. And because it was a medical incident, I was able to graduate high school and get on to university, only because this special incident that actually doctors and my parents worked with the school board, acknowledging my diagnosis at the time, and said that this would be similar to any other disease. So I really lucked out and was able to graduate with all my peers, even though I had a serious incident of psychosis. So moving into university, I was always kind of worried about it happening again, and it's triggered by stress. And as university wore on over the years, the most stressful year was my final year. And it happened again, but it was worse this time. So in my early 20s, I had another massive episode. It was a manic episode that landed me in the hospital for about 7 or 8 weeks. And again, coinciding with the stress of graduation. And so I was put into a psych ward for the first time in a locked unit, and put on a regimen of therapeutic medications. And that's where I was at the age of 24 when I finished university. That was not the place I wanted to be at that time in my life.
Mm. So was it around that time or during that time that they kind of, because I know you have talked about being manic, what they call manic depressive now is bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
What had that by that time given it a name that this is what you were dealing with?
Yeah. So I was diagnosed at that time. And I'll tell you this, growing up my whole life, the word manic depressive was always thrown around because I had a great uncle that had that diagnosis, and he died quite young, in some mysterious circumstances around he died in a car accident, and we weren't really sure how that came to be, if it was an accident or if it was intentional, and it's just something our family doesn't know. So we'd always use that term manic depressive, and around the time that I was diagnosed, then I was diagnosed with bipolar type 1. And even in my late teens, when I graduated high school, there was a tentative diagnosis of bipolar disorder on the table, and it was only really just confirmed when I had my next major episode and was hospitalized. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So what is the difference between kind of the two episodes, between a period where you're really manic, where you're manic, and then the other side of that when you're kind of dealing with depression?
Yeah. So mania, the way that it looks for me is I need very little sleep or no sleep. So a manic episode may start where I would think it's a good idea to only get 4 hours of sleep, because I can work late into the night, sleep, and then wake up. If you're manic, the quality of sleep that you're getting in those 4 hours is not restorative. It's not healthy. It's not a deep type of sleep. And so you're up in the morning and right back at it, chasing those ideas. So you got a lot of creative inspiration, and start, obsessively organizing things and work to be really productive. So, part of the reason why I think I see it manifest in a lot of university students is because they're put to the task of being creative, fitting a lot of things into their schedule, taking on a lot of stress. And so that's how I was dealing with university. And at the time, I was riding little manic waves throughout my whole university undergrad education. So, I would think, hey, this is a great idea. This is totally normal for me in my first 7 or 8 semesters of university. So for 3 years, to take 5 classes, which is the maximum, and pack them all in, and succeed with, carrying a B average through all of those. But I mean, I even packed them in between Wednesday and Thursday. So Wednesday and Thursday, I was going to university and taking classes for 11 to 13 hours. And then Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday were all days that I would have a very active social life. And so things are very unbalanced like that for individuals who are unstable, unmedicated, that may be bipolar and have a propensity for mania. Now, the flip side of that, depression, is something that I think that a lot of people, if you haven't felt a clinical level of depression, it's just hard to really understand. But it feels like the most heavy blanket is weighing you down, and your mind is going at a snail's pace, and it's confusing to gather your thoughts. And you don't have a great opinion of yourself. And part of the whole piece of this is that, doing the dishes, taking a shower, making your bed, sweeping the floor, vacuuming, the most basic tasks, organizing your backpack, all of those sorts of things. When it comes to depression, and for people with bipolar disorder, depression can last 6, 8, 10, 15 months at a time. And it's often followed by a massive crash, right? Mm-hmm. So you crash down from mania into depression. So that's what it would look like for me, poor hygiene, staring at the TV screen, and so, I'm not proud to say it, but I mean, in many ways, it is funny. I think I've seen Star Trek: The Next Generation all the way through 2 times because that was on daytime TV. The same goes with all of CSI and all of Law and Order and every single possible branch of Law and Order. I've probably watched maybe 300 hours of Jerry Springer because of those times in my life where I was depressed, just on my side, staring at the TV screen, unmedicated. That's me. If I don't see a psychiatrist, I don't take my medication, and I'm not in contact with my family doctor. Yeah.
So when you ended up in the hospital and that time, what were things like after that whole period? Did things kind of balance out, or was that still in that depressive phase? Or
what I would say is I was depressed, but there's another aspect to this, and that's I was embarrassed that I had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and I was 25 years old, and something that I see in a lot of people that have mental health conditions in their mid-20s, which is where it manifests for many people, is that it's more than just a fear of missing out. It's a complete fear of being connected with peers, because a doctor will say, go to bed early, take your medication, don't smoke marijuana, it'll mess with your medication. Don't drink, it'll mess with your medication. I don't know what people are thinking listening to this about what your average 25-year-old kid is up to, but they're probably staying up late, going to music festivals. They probably are going to have a drink, and marijuana usage is totally within the realm of possibility. And that was a definite fear of being completely, it just seemed like everyone was planning to go out and do things at 9 p.m. And I was trying to get my sleep back into a regular schedule, right? So I felt completely disconnected from my friends in a social life. Here's an interesting piece that goes along with all this. So once I finally got well, I realized that there were whole timelines in my life, like a 2-year block where I was trying to deal with my symptoms, where I didn't pay attention to what the popular movies were that people were going out on dates to, because I didn't have an active social life. Like I didn't know what popular TV shows people were watching, because I was too focused on trying to get my life together, going to support group meetings in the evening, and just not really spending time with people. It's just like you feel like you drop off the map. So there's a social side to it, but then the psychological recovery side is also it's a painstaking process, especially right when you get out of the hospital. By no means when you get out of the hospital would I say an individual leaving the psych ward is stable. They are, to make an analogy or a comparison, they would be as stable as someone who has just left the hospital, who got a few stents put in their heart. That individual still needs to follow a particular diet to keep them out of the hospital, to follow a regimen of exercise, and to continue to meet with a doctor. And there's a similar thing when the brain goes through such a traumatic event, like a manic episode and a long period in a psych ward, where your mind has to recover and sort of stabilize. So, every time I've been in the psych ward, it's been a lengthy recovery. Yeah. And
how do you think that you early on especially coped with things? I mean, was it seeing a psychiatrist, or was it kind of, as some people would say, self-medicating with alcohol or things like that? How did you early on kind of come to terms, especially being in your mid-20s and trying to get to some sense of stable life?
Yeah, what happened was I self-medicated from ages 25 to 29. And if anyone has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, I really think that self-medicating is probably the worst idea for you. I have always succeeded by following the directions of my family doctor and my psychiatrist and counselors. So I didn't receive any degree of success until I was 29. When I said like it takes 2 years sort of for you to come to terms with a schedule and to kind of accept drug therapy and all that. Well, from age 25 to 29, I was hospitalized 3 more times. Wow. Not because I was, and it was almost like it was almost like on a schedule. Like in 2007, it was in December. 2008, it was in November, and the next. So just like every year in the fall or winter, I'd end up back in the hospital until one time where I felt unwell and voluntarily checked myself in, and eventually that led to me listening to the psychiatrist for some reason, which I think there's a faith element to this for myself. Some reason I was mentally and physically and spiritually prepared to do absolutely everything it took to maintain some mental wellness. And so I said, I'll do whatever a psychiatrist says. I'll take whatever suggestions they're making. Life has gotten as bad as it can be. And so, what I did to settle in at the age of 29 was I committed to going to group therapy first of all, hospitalized for 5 months, at a treatment center for people that are dual diagnosis, so addiction and mental health conditions. So they had psychiatrists and addictions counselors. The other part of it was I made a commitment every Tuesday for a year and a half after my release. I would go to group therapy, and I did that, and I didn't miss a single week. And I committed to being involved in support groups. I got active in my church community. So, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being all sort of became a priority, because I just said, I'll listen to absolutely everything that a doctor has to say as a suggestion, and I'll just take it. And it worked, thankfully.
So what was your faith like up to this point? Knowing that you had grown up Lutheran, but where did you feel God was in all of this, up to being 29, especially in those years between 25 and 29?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is I had a great upbringing in the Lutheran Church and had an awesome connection to faith. And because of living in a family where mental wellness kind of plummeted for everyone in the family around the age of 15 for myself, it was a confusing time. And I think that I blamed the church for a lot of, the chaos that was happening in my life. And I stepped away from the church for 14 years. And then when I was 29 and I got sober again, I somehow became open-minded enough to consider going back to church, because I kind of looked back at the 14 years that I'd been away from the church, and I thought, there were times where I certainly was living by faith, really. Mm-hmm. There were times where I would be shouting out to someone, just profanity, shouting it out on my bed, and in a way just asking for help from God. And there was no one else in the apartment. I was just shouting out, and I remembered that. And people were asking me, when were times in your life where you lived by faith, even though you said that you didn't believe in God? And that was one of the times, right? There were many times that I could look back over the 14 years in my late teens and early adulthood where I still had a foundational belief in God. It's just that when I finally found a little bit of stability with my mental health, I realized that the faith piece of this all, the spirituality piece of this all, is part of the solution for me. And so I kind of embraced that and found out a lot of good stuff about grace and forgiveness. And I started to feel good in my own skin again. Yeah.
And then what made you start to think about ministry?
So I was at a crossroads where, in my active addiction, I was actively pursuing a career as a stand-up comedian, and I'd
Mm-hmm.
done work as an amateur comedian, and um, was doing some semi-professional work as a comedian, and um, it just was not realistic for me as someone who was brand new in recovery, and just trying to embrace a routine where I could just take my medication at the same time every day, get to bed around the same time every day, wake up in the morning, uh, you know, and live a productive life. I just, no one in my support group, I had a support group and they all said, yeah, pursuing your dream of being a comedian right now is not a good idea. Um, and so I had to kind of let that go. And, once I'd let that go, I was active in my church, and I had a pastor who had worked as a chaplain in the federal corrections institutes of Canada, and his story appealed to me. Working in that environment and working with inmates,
Mm.
and I just had never really thought about ministry in that way, and so I didn't know what I was getting into, so I contacted the seminary. They wouldn't let me alone, really. They continued to pursue and recruit me. And a few years after that, then I was getting my Master of Divinity, and I was in seminary. And it was really just because I was interested in helping people. I was at a crossroads where I think, people were saying, are you going to be a counselor? Are you going to be an addictions counselor? Are you going to work doing that? Are you going to be a social worker? And I considered those briefly, but for some reason, the creativity that a pastor has, I think, really that was what attracted me. Like helping people in a way that was in some way creative and inspirational. I really just found that to be the best fit for me, really. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you go through seminary, and then you're going to a first call, or maybe even a second call.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of our previous iterations of this, you talked a little bit about the difficulty sometimes in bringing up mental illness. And in fact,
Mm-hmm.
you didn't. And we'll get to when you actually do come forward to talk about that. But what was it about that you didn't feel comfortable bringing up? And I think you've also talked about that it seems a lot easier to talk about addiction, pastors with addiction, than it is a pastor with a mental illness.
Mm-hmm. So I came into the whole candidacy process to become a pastor, and I was a little bit intimidated that there were many hoops that I needed to jump through, and the background check, and I was someone who had a major addiction issue, and I just was concerned about that. And then even thinking about the fact that I'd been in a psych ward 4 times kind of just terrified me. And so that was just in the back of my head as well. So to become a candidate, to become a pastor, and part of the whole process of getting my master's degree meant that I got a psych evaluation. And I put that off for years. And finally, the seminary was like, you got to get this done. We're surprised you haven't done it by now. And I went and I did it. And, I think there was maybe one question about, if I'd been diagnosed with anything and what I do to treat it. And I told her, and, nothing happened. And then soon after that, I became an intern pastor, and, people were like, share your story about being a recovering addict that's really inspirational. And I did. And sometimes it works its way into my sermon, and family members of recovering addicts would approach me and have coffee with me. There were folks that would be attending the church that I was an intern pastor at, and it sparked a lot of meaningful conversations. However, I just didn't want to talk about also having bipolar disorder. At that stage, I didn't feel comfortable. I wasn't sure about your average layperson about what they actually knew about bipolar disorder. I wouldn't know if people would see me in a different light. I didn't see a lot of people in leadership positions openly discussing the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And, people often told me, you don't have to tell anyone. You don't ever have to tell your employer. You don't ever have to share this with anyone you don't want to. And I didn't really see any leaders in the church doing it. So, so for 5 years, I was an intern pastor, and was in my first call and into my second call, where I just kept quiet about it. Worked with a lot of people that had relatives or were individuals that were attending churches that had mood disorders or other related mental health conditions, and just sort of never opened up about my own history. Yeah.
Was there a fear that people would find out and reject you?
Well, yeah. And, I had heard when I first sort of was kicking around the idea, a few other pastors had said, people might be worried about how someone with bipolar in a leadership position that also has some influence over the church's finances, that there would be some concern around that, because folks with bipolar disorder, when they're not well, can spend a lot of money. So there's that. Or someone else mentioned something where they said a symptom of bipolar disorder is hypersexuality. So there might be a concern that you would cheat on your wife, or be promiscuous with parishioners. And I think those are all fair generalizations, like maybe unfair generalizations is the better term, because they're all things where I'm like, duh, yeah, I know the list of symptoms maybe better than most people, but it doesn't mean that it's going to happen in my life, and it only worries me more when people bring that kind of stuff up, right? So that kind of hindered me from being open, because in the back of my mind I was thinking, if I announce this, are people going to be thinking, okay, well, now I'm worried about him absconding with a parishioner, or misappropriating funding, or not showing up to work, or even becoming delusional or something like that. That was my concern. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that kind of leads up to what happened this Lent.
Yeah.
And you started a campaign that came up on YouTube, mm-hmm. and actually got shared with the wider synod that you're a part of, called Give Up the Stigma.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? What was the genesis behind that, and what was the result?
So I thought, hey, this would be something that I'm feeling ready to share, where I can just be honest about it, preach about it, provide some education within my congregation about it. And around the same time, I was considering that the synod, the St. Paul Synod, offered a small mental health grant and I applied for it, and I received some funding. And I was going to put that funding towards some education. Some educational seminars are going to be happening at our church. And so I put that whole piece together and decided that I would launch things in just with one video and explain I'm a clergy person. I have bipolar disorder. And if anyone feels comfortable talking about mental health and mental health conditions this Lent, then definitely give that up for Lent. Give up the stigma of mental health conditions for Lent alongside of me, and we can talk about it, just so that a dialogue could begin. And that's what the invitation was, and it got shared around to a lot of people, and a lot of people got quite excited about it. So I was happy and overwhelmed that there was such a response. Yeah.
And what was the response, especially within your congregation?
Within my congregation, I mean, a huge percentage of the congregation came to a place where they were just admitting that there were people in their lives, or they were people themselves, that have some connection to a mental health condition, right? So anything from someone who takes antidepressants and who doesn't ever really feel like they can share about it, someone who needs a sun lamp for seasonal affective disorder, to individuals whose child may have a mood disorder, every single possible way that you think that something could be connected, like generational trauma from schizophrenia in the family. There were all sorts of stories and experiences, and if people didn't have someone close to them, then it just fit in perfectly, because we found a lot of people that were willing to just be helpers, to learn more, to listen more, and to experience where faith and mental health can kind of dwell in the same space. Yeah.
And in kind of that bringing up, as it has been, people within the congregation kind of sharing their own stories, do you think that that's kind of helped in some ways of openness within your congregation, but even probably outside of it, and helping people understand people living with mental illness? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that there's two ways that it really helped outside the the congregation. Like, the one way was every week our regular churchgoers were getting a chance to take in a sermon that was, reflective on some aspect of mental health and spirituality. So the Sunday sermon was a longer piece, and then the Wednesday night services, those were shorter pieces where people could think, reflect, and then take it to the coffee hour and sit around, and you just saw table after table of people talking about really interesting and vital things. But then in terms of how this had reach outside of the community, I just started getting contacted by people who were, who were not related to our church, and because either through press or other types of through social media, they would reach out to me and share a story, sit down and want to talk and have a phone conversation about mental health, and just how they've never really had a chance to talk to a pastor about something like this. Yeah.
How do you think the church has handled mental illness as a whole? It seems like from your result, this is something that we don't really always talk about, and it seems like it's always something that is kept in the shadows.
Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that there's a few things at play here. I think that sometimes people at church are not willing to, historically speaking, this is historically in the church, are not really willing to talk about anything along the emotional spectrum. If it brings up emotions in a person, sometimes people can really just go back on their old behavior, and just remain stoic, which a lot of people at churches, especially Lutheran churches, do. They don't want to bring up anything that kind of upsets them. So trauma or anything that brings up shame, especially like shame's a huge part of having a mental health diagnosis. So some people just would be like, if I'm ashamed around people at my church, then traditionally I've learned to kind of suppress that. So that's one aspect to it, I think. And I think another aspect to it is that maybe the church has been a little bit too self-sufficient on the reach of spirituality when it comes to our own wellness. I think that maybe there's sort of just been this idea that the church is the place that if you're not well, you will come to and you'll be healed. This is the place where everything begins and ends. This is, and I definitely think 30, 40 years ago, the importance of a pastor, as it relates to absolutely everything that you would need to be counseled, that would be the person who would counsel you. Forget a psychologist, forget a psychiatrist, forget talking to your doctor about anything like that. That's just not the world we live in today. It's a completely different world out there. And so it's maybe right now the church is a little bit behind on, seeing how we fit into a community of wellness where there's other organizations and other places where people can receive help alongside with the assistance of a doctor getting, maybe you can think about how your pastor does one thing, but he's limited, and the same would be with a psychiatrist or a doctor. There would be certain limitations where they can't help you on certain things. But if you want to talk about hope, grace, forgiveness, and really self-acceptance, then the pastor's the right place to go. But if you want to talk about finding something to treat your delusional thinking, then I think you better go to a psychiatrist, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that leads to this question is,
sure,
where can the church be supportive? Because obviously there are certain things it can't do, and that's why we do have psychiatrists and psychologists and medicine and all of that. But where can the church offer support to people who are dealing with mental illness, or people whose families have a loved one that's dealing with mental illness?
I think that for the church to be a part of a comprehensive community network of support, I think that educated decisions have to be made by church leadership on where are the gaps locally. I think things need to be thought of in on a community level, right? And that's where the church can really begin to bridge gaps where people are falling through the cracks. I think that the church can often be the first place that someone in a mental health crisis could turn, right? So in order to be prepared, I think that every church should put it on a high priority to have some way to respond to mental health and wellness crises, right? I think that church staff and pastors need to understand that that's a role where that the church is going to have to play. And I think that's a lot of what our congregation has done since the beginning of the campaign in Lent, is that the congregation has said, wow, there's a huge deficit in our community, right? There's people who want to have counseling but can't find counseling. There's people living with undiagnosed mental health conditions that need to be referred to the right organizations. And there are people out there that have all of these other related problems, like food insecurity, homelessness, spousal abuse, which all seems to relate back to some root problem with lack of support for mental health conditions, right? Like that. So the people who come to our food shelf, are our food shelf volunteers prepared to refer to any organization locally that can help with counseling and other things if they begin to get to know people and understand more about their life and see red flags and start passing on information to our clients to see if they can also get them help outside of just providing them meals, right? And also to think about we get many calls from people just out of the blue that just need help at the church office here. And are we ready? Do we have plans in place? Have we thought about it? And so our church really, I think, is in the process of becoming better prepared to serve the community in that way. And there's an openness to do that I don't think has existed in our congregation before. And it really came about because people were willing to have conversations about this. Yeah.
So, coming that you come from Canada, and one of the things that I've heard a lot, especially here and even in my own congregation, is really in some ways how hard it is sometimes for people to get really even adequate mental health care. Sometimes to even find a bed for hospitalization. And I'm kind of curious if that has been a problem in Canada as well. And maybe just kind of a larger question of why do you think that seems, we've made such advances when it comes to everything else kind of health-wise, but it seems like with mental health, there's still ways to go to kind of helping people when they're dealing with that part of their health.
Yeah. Well, I think that if we were to look closely, and I'm pretty confident that through my experience and through the experience of many of my other peers that are living well with mental health conditions and that have been hospitalized in the past, I think that the majority of mental health discharges, if you have a look at them, the motivation behind each of those discharges is to free up bed space, to be honest, because there just isn't enough bed space in just regular hospitals. There aren't enough psychiatric beds for patients, and so it shows that there's something missing in between critical care for folks that have mental health conditions and are in a mental health crisis to moving back home. There has to be something more in between. There has to be something, like I was lucky enough that I had a 5-month program from a private hospital paid for to get me to the point of self-sufficiency and independent living. However, I'm a minority in that. The majority of people get out of the hospital as soon as they want to, or as soon as the team of psychiatrists get them out, really. So, and that's why people sometimes don't make the connection. They wonder, they'll see folks that are not well on the street and they're like, who in their family is looking out for them? I'm like, that individual may not want help from anyone, even their family, maybe even less so from their family. When you see someone who can't take care of themselves, that obviously is either delusional or is hallucinating on the street and is not well kept, and people I wonder who's connected to them, who's their family, all that. Well, it's not necessarily a matter of family. My life could have gone that way. My mom always says that my life could have gone that way. I'm lucky that I had stuff provided for me to bridge the gap, because there's that huge gap missing, and that's the big missing piece, is that somehow we need to fund that, find ways to fill that in. But again, I think that in many ways, churches, pastors, deacons, church councils, they can look at how can they make a modest contribution to bridging that gap. Yeah.
Well, kind of as we wrap up, I wanted to do 2 questions
Sure.
to talk about. Is one is, how can churches be better, I guess, for lack of a better term, allies in helping people within their communities, but in the wider communities who are experiencing and dealing with mental illness?
Mm-hmm. Well, the National Alliance on Mental Illness is a place for resources and workshops, and they can do resources online. They can do Zoom meetings. They can be in person. They can work with any church out there to develop the church's overall skills in responding to the needs of individuals. So there are lists of numerous seminars that are suitable for church leadership and the general congregation. So that's one way. And every local county's health unit and just general municipal governments, they also provide support groups, and there's county medical officials that you can reach out and see what the needs are in your county. I think that our church leadership needs to think about what's happening at our local level and where there are gaps, because the biggest thing the biggest asset that churches have is space. And if a church is able, and they're often, churches are in accessible spaces and central spaces, and churches can make it all very easy for organizations to work out of, partner with, in order to provide community services and also to, and if people in your church are looking for places to assist, then they can also provide volunteer hours for those organizations too. So I think that you have to also look at who are those players locally that you can assist. So regionally here, there's there's Lake Area youth and family counseling service, and they are on a shoestring budget, and they can barely hire enough counselors, and counselors are so hard to come by right now, and they're in desperate need of fundraising, and so that's something churches need to look at and acknowledge. If there are community organizations that provide support for people with mental health conditions, is there any way that you can look at helping them with fundraising too? Because money goes a long way as well. So,
and if there is someone in a situation that you were in, maybe that even is a pastor themselves, that have a history of mental illness, what advice, and they haven't really shared that with anyone, or shared their struggles with anyone, what advice would you give them?
Well, if someone that I know, if someone that I've never met before, and they're living with a diagnosis. So yeah, okay. If someone is living with a diagnosis of some mental health condition, and they're kind of feeling the way that I was, where they really didn't feel comfortable sharing anything about their mental health condition with anyone. I think, first of all, it's something you totally can keep to yourself if you're comfortable with it. That's one thing. But if you want to, then, I mean, I always started off this whole thing. I started small, really. I started sharing with friends that were outside of my circle of family that maybe I would like to share and open up with about what I go through to, every day to maintain my mental wellness. So I think that if you're in a leadership position, if you're like me, I would continue to build a group of supportive friends around you. That's something I've always had. I've always had people I can call, text, talk to that know everything about me. But on the other hand, I think that anyone in a leadership position, pastors, CEOs, people in finance, doctors, even if you are allowed to speak openly about this, if it doesn't hurt your career in any way, then yeah, I would love to see more leaders out there share that they live with bipolar disorder. I'd love to see more people in leadership position. If it in no way negatively affects your job, or you're in some way restricted to under your contract or through whatever regulating body gives you your credentials or anything like that. By all means, I'd love to see more, athletes and celebrities and pastors even. It's okay if you're a pastor, you can share this info. Be great to see more leaders talk about what they go through to stay well. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. If someone wants to kind of contact you or on the internet, watch the videos, where should they go?
They should look for Seth Perry on YouTube. All of my videos are share, and we'll always share the hashtag give up the stigma, because I'm continuing to make video content throughout this summer with the hashtag give up the stigma, all one word. And you can direct message me on Instagram at vegan pastor. There's all sorts of ways. Just Google my name. You should be able to find me.
All right. Well, Seth, thank you very much for taking the time to chat. This was a great interview. I'm glad it finally actually got to work this time.
Awesome. I'm glad too.
All right. Take care.
Awesome. Thank you.